Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Ron DeSantis is sinking fast, and he hasn't even announced his candidacy yet. Even the white media, who's tried to make it seem like there was some sort of horse race between him and Trump, has finally had to admit what the black media's been telling you all along. DeSantis is an empty suit, and he knows it. That's why he's been basing his entire persona on being a mini-Trump, and on doing whatever attention-seeking stunt he could to get the white media to talk about him, though mainly all he's gotten is FaceTime on Fox News. But by going so hard to the right that he flew off a cliff, he's branded himself as that crazy guy down in Florida who wants to ban books and Mickey Mouse. He never figured out that the road to the White House doesn't run through Tucker Carlson's studio. But then again, when you take advice from a talentless nobody like Christopher Rufo, you're guaranteed to fail. Of course, Rufo isn't going to tell DeSantis that he's sinking whatever deluded hopes of being president he had right now. DeSantis is a useful idiot for incompetent blowhards like Rufo, and I'm sure Rufo's surprised that DeSantis hasn't thrown him overboard. But it just goes to show how utterly short-sighted and desperate DeSantis actually is. He wanted to brand himself as Trump without the baggage. But what he really is Sarah Palin without the dim-witted folksy charm. DeSantis is an empty vessel. That's why he's been such a willing tool for political snake oil salesmen like Rufo. He's just smart enough to know that he has no charisma, he doesn't connect with people, he has no ideas, and is as likable as hemorrhoids. But he's also just dumb enough to think that he could overcome his unlikability by attacking black people and libraries full time. He's made himself the candidate of a few blood-red counties in Florida, Texas, and Georgia, but now he's made it impossible to be seen as anything other than a clown who's just seeking attention. His one big chance to show people his knowledge of foreign policy was when he spoke about the war in Ukraine, and what does he do? He says Ukraine is a territorial dispute and the U.S. basically needs to limit its involvement. Even DeSantis' own rich white donors like the Manhattan Institute didn't like the sound of that. See, this is what happens when an incompetent tool attempts to run for high office and you let him off his leash and see what he can do on his own. The same deficiencies and insecurities that made DeSantis so mediocre are still there. He's a pawn who desperately wants to be a king, but all he can do is be manipulated by professional BS artists like Rufo, who I'm sure is surprised that DeSantis hasn't cut ties with him, but how can he? DeSantis has no ideas and doesn't have a clue. He has no choice but to take whatever instructions these white right think tanks and their operatives give him because he doesn't know anything, not about the electorate or about himself. He knows that he's too weak, too dumb, and too uninteresting for anyone to seriously see him as presidential material. What he ought to be doing is showing people how knowledgeable he is about domestic and foreign affairs. But with his comments on Ukraine, he showed everyone he's still a Bush League frat rat who made the mistake of thinking far higher of himself than he ought to. But he's not fooling anyone. DeSantis has overestimated the appeal and the necessity of being able to get the media to talk about you. Sure, getting headlines is vitally important, but it's not the only thing. After all, DeSantis could go ahead and strip butt naked, slather himself in peanut butter, and set himself on fire in front of the Statue of Liberty. That would get plenty of headlines, but it wouldn't get any votes, and that's the thing that DeSantis is too hard-headed to understand. All these attention-whoring stunts, all the damage that he did to Florida's reputation in the eyes of businesses, schools, and the country, all of it for nothing. Now, to be sure, miracles, accidents, and wacky, unforeseen circumstances can and do happen, so I'm not going to say that this is a definitive tombstone or epitaph for Ron DeSantis' political career, but I will say that the Masons have the hammer and chisel at the ready. Before we go any further, I'm sure there's more than a few folks who are going to say, but Professor, there's been a poll out saying that DeSantis has taken a slight lead in early Iowa and New Hampshire polls. First of all, those primaries in New Hampshire and Iowa don't happen until next year, so I think it's safe to say the numbers aren't solid. It's a little bit premature to be saying anything. Secondly, and most importantly, when you look at the New Hampshire and Iowa polls historically, the winners of those caucuses have generally gone on to lose the nomination to someone else who blows right by them. In 2016, Bernie Sanders beat Hillary in the New Hampshire primary by a country mile, and in Iowa, Ted Cruz beat everyone, including Donald Trump. In 2020, the same thing. Pete Buttigieg beat everybody in the Iowa caucus, including Biden, who was in the race at that time. But in New Hampshire, it was Bernie who won the 2020 primary, beating everyone, including Biden. So if you want to lean on those two caucuses in particular, you can. But history's shown that the early primaries, and those two in particular, are not an indicator of who's going to actually get the nomination, much less win the presidency. The candidate who gets out front early usually burns out first too. About the only outlier in that case would be, well, Donald Trump. But he was an anomaly, and you can't base an analysis on an anomaly. The white media hypes these early primaries because there's a 24-hour news cycle and they gotta fill it with something, but they also do it because they are the first primaries in the country and elections are good for ratings. For the empty-headed pundits, the presidential elections and the midterms are their version of the Super Bowl. It's about the only time anyone actually cares what they have to say. Most of the polling is showing Donald Trump well ahead of DeSantis. Though there are a handful of polls that are trying to say the opposite, though I couldn't help but notice with more than little weasel words in their so-called analysis. But you gotta understand that a lot of these polls are being either produced or they're being pushed by groups who don't like Trump to begin with. People who can't stand the idea that he might actually retake the White House, especially after he led an insurrection against the government. The headlines about the handful of polls that show DeSantis ahead, they read more like propaganda meant to coronate DeSantis and to downplay the disastrous performance that he's had in most of the polls, especially since Trump started taking potshots at him. DeSantis is out of his element, and it shows. That's why he sticks to all of those phony staged press conferences where he doesn't do anything other than give a speech, where he announces that he's going to ban some books about black people or that he's going to arrest black people for voting, etc. DeSantis has no idea what it means to actually have to fight for a nomination because he's never had to. Florida is a solid red state. When it comes to winning races that would make him the chief executive of a governmental branch, about the only notches he's got on his belt is when he beat Andrew Bussy Gillum, and last year when he beat the suntanned cadaver Charlie Crist. That's not a test of anything. And DeSantis himself knows this. That's why after he beat Andrew Gillum, he immediately pivoted to try to reinvent himself as being a Trump acolyte. Because when you haven't actually been in a real fight in your entire life, your best bet is to try to imitate someone who has. But that only works until someone inevitably takes you up on your trash talking. Trump is showing DeSantis that he's going to go scorched earth on him, and DeSantis' response has been to say that he's going to concentrate on fighting Biden instead. DeSantis has no idea how weak that makes him look. He has a candidate standing in front of him saying, "I want to fight you," and DeSantis' response is, I'm going to go fight someone else. He's running. That's what it looks like, because that's what it is. DeSantis' attention whoring was a damned-to-fail tactic from the beginning because it could never work. Trump can get away with being a professional pipe bomb thrower, but he's from outside the political system. DeSantis, on the other hand, is a product of the political system. The same attacks that Trump made against his rivals in 2016 will work against DeSantis too. Trump is actually right when he points out that DeSantis has no real wins, no real accomplishments, and that he's weak and indecisive, that he's an establishment stooge in the mold of Paul Ryan. DeSantis claims that Florida's current economic status is all because of him, but Trump points out Florida was successful long before DeSantis came along, and he also points out how high crime is in Florida as well. Trump is doing this not only to cut the legs out from under DeSantis, but he's also doing it as an ever so clumsy attempt to try to make a case to the right-of-center types that he failed to win in 2020. He's not just trying to beat DeSantis, he's trying to appeal to the voters who didn't go for him 3 years ago. He knows that he only has 2 years to make the case. DeSantis has started doing interviews, well, at least one of them, and he's tried to speak on national issues, but every time he opens his mouth, something stupid falls out. Hell, the Lincoln Project is already lampooning him over his Piers Morgan interview because when he was asked about where he was on 9/11, he couldn't actually say where he was. Apparently, he couldn't remember. He tried to talk his way around the question, and it didn't work. If this is what he's doing on something as meaningless as where were you on 9/11, what's he going to do when a real question about real issues come along? Well, as we saw with Ukraine, he's going to put his feet in his mouth. DeSantis is like a fish out of water because for the last 3 years, he's been spending all of his time pushing a war against black people. The problem with that is most of the questions that he's going to get aren't going to have anything to do with black people at all. That's why he keeps getting caught flat-footed every time he tries to answer reporters' questions on even basic things. His interviews become a fiasco. That is, unless he's talking to Tucker Carlson, where the questions will be, "Let's talk about your war on black people." Every time someone other than Fox talks to DeSantis, it becomes a mess. No wonder he's falling behind in the polls. He can't actually persuade anyone to vote for him. He can barely even express himself. Empty vessel puppets like DeSantis and Sarah Palin are very attractive to the GOP donor class because they're mindless robots who will do their boss's bidding. But the problem is they're also mindless robots who can't beat a thinking opponent either. That's something the GOP establishment, who are the never-Trumpers by the way, simply don't understand because they don't want to. As I told you on my last video essay about this issue, when you have money and power, you tend to create a bubble around yourself. And you only allow people into that bubble who are going to tell you what you want to hear, which is usually how smart you are. When you have enough money, you can create your own little island around yourself. One where the real world never gets to intrude. And while that works when you're running a business, especially one that lives off of government money, it fails the moment that you come out of the bubble into the real world, and you have to deal with millions of different people with different and often opposing opinions. The wealthy plutocrats who back DeSantis are cocooned from reality, and they demand a candidate who's as sheltered and closed off from reality as they are. Chris Rufo admitted that he was deliberately lying about critical race theory because the GOP's plan is to have people read something crazy in the newspaper and think CRT. Well, that's what's happened with DeSantis. Every time people look up and hear about some racist censorship in Florida or some other nuttiness like banning books about Rosa Parks from the libraries, they think of Ron DeSantis. It's one thing to appeal to a general electorate. It's another entirely to appeal to a party's political base. But DeSantis is barely even doing that much. He's just trying to appeal to the hardest of the hardcore right-wing racists because that's all he's got. He's incapable of thinking, so naturally he tries to identify and capture as many other unthinking people as he can. DeSantis' biggest problem is that he's a fraud, and he knows it. Trying to bluff his way past interviews didn't work for Sarah Palin, and it won't work for him either. Piers Morgan went light on DeSantis mainly because there's a lot of reporters and journalists who utterly detest Trump with every fiber of their beings, so they'd like to avoid damaging DeSantis if they can. But this won't last because at the end of the day, conflict sells. So the white media can't play kid gloves with DeSantis forever, especially not when he finally gets up the courage to announce his candidacy. After that, when reporters get a chance to embarrass him, they'll take it, and before long, Trump will have a demo reel of DeSantis fumbling, stumbling, and bumbling his way from one humiliating interaction to the next, showing everyone how unqualified he is to be president. It will be Sarah Palin all over again, only with less likability. And the collective weight of one public humiliation after the next will weigh DeSantis down until he erodes what support he thinks he has from the Republican base. Even if DeSantis did have a brain, he still would get crushed by Trump, just like Jeb Bush did. Jeb Bush, you'll recall, was also governor of Florida, and he presided over an economy far stronger than the one DeSantis has. Jeb also came from a blue-chip political dynasty, but Trump turned that into a weakness. That's what Trump excels at, identifying his opponent's weaknesses and then attacking them. That's why you see Trump using the attacks he's doing against DeSantis. He's already shown what he's going to do. DeSantis has tried to brand himself as being so concerned about protecting children from groomers. Trump has tipped his hand and shown that he's going to expose DeSantis as Florida's groomer-in-chief. And because the only two skills DeSantis has ever cultivated is to be a Trump groupie and to scream racial code words like critical race theory and woke all the time, just like he was in Florida last year when the hurricane struck and the white media wanted to know why he had neglected the state's insurance crisis. DeSantis can't actually answer any questions. That's why he sticks to friendly forums like Fox News or doing press conferences where he's the only one allowed to speak. But he won't be able to win the presidency or even get the nomination that way. A prevent defense won't work for him. Now sure, in last year's Arizona gubernatorial race, Katie Hobbs refused to debate Kari Lake, but that was because she didn't have to. By refusing to engage with Kari Lake, Katie Hobbs was denying Lake the oxygen she needed to expand her profile. Kari Lake was the one who wanted to debate, not Katie Hobbs. Ultimately, Hobbs won the governorship. DeSantis is also hoping for the same conditions, but that only works if you're already in the lead. DeSantis is not. So far, all he has are his performative extremist stunts, but that's not going to carry him to the top of the polls. He hasn't faced any tough questions about anything. If he wants to be president, he'll have to appeal to more than just the hardcore racist MAGA base. And that means he's going to have to start doing some interviews, and it's obvious he's terrified of that. A dimwit with stage fright. His inevitable implosion promises to be spectacular, and I'm there for it. This is not, however, to say that I like Trump. I don't. The Orange Man didn't do us any favors as president, except for maybe one. His unvarnished racism made it clear to a lot of people who have been trying to sit on the fence that they better fight white power if they want to survive. People couldn't deny the situation they were in. They couldn't deny white supremacy any longer with Trump in the White House. Trump did more than anyone to mobilize people against white supremacy by being an unabashed white supremacist, one that people couldn't deny. But Trump's ascension also made something else clear. The Democratic Party is not to be taken seriously. They did nothing except say, vote for us. And in the last few years, they've produced nothing for black people at all. There are no tangible benefits to voting for them. They are, as I told you, a DC-based social club. They don't care about anything outside the Beltway. So all those school boards you see censoring books and ethnically cleansing the schools, all of the unconstitutional laws that the Republicans have been allowed to pass at the state level, the Democratic Party doesn't care about that. This is the result of having two geriatric grifters like Pelosi and Schumer in charge for so long. All they know how to do is to collect their bribes, political contributions from their donors. Corrupt corporations and wealthy individuals who they allow to violate the law and the public's rights with impunity. That's the Democrats' priority. They have not spelled out what they're going to do to be competitive in local or statewide races because they don't care about those. That's why citizens had to be the ones to organize themselves to hold statewide referendums against the abortion bans. And in Florida, it was citizens who had to organize themselves to stop the state's felon voting prohibition laws. Now, things like that are supposed to be the responsibility of the Democratic Party, but they didn't do it. Citizens had to do the job of the Democrats for them, and that being the case, what the hell do you need the Democratic Party for then? The problem for the Democrats happens to be, especially what we saw with Nancy Pelosi, they don't want to give rise to any political rivals. That's why you don't see Democrats focusing on those local races. As far as they're concerned, they don't want to cultivate a bumper crop of political rivals. And truth be told, that was the real reason that Nancy Pelosi didn't really like Alexandria Cortez and why those two locked horns a couple of times. As far as the Democrats at the top are concerned, their job is job security. But even with Pelosi gone, things are not going to change. You have the slack-jawed, mouth-breathing moron Hakeem Jeffries, and he's going to be useless as he's been his entire life. This clown can barely form a coherent sentence. Now, while I'm sure he went to school, I'll bet you any amount of money he took a very special bus to school. And just like when Donna Brazile was chairwoman of the DNC for a hot minute, blink and you would have missed it, the Democrats also have no long-term plans for Hakeem Jeffries. His expiration date has already been made out. He's a seat warmer. Just something to try to say, look, we put a black guy in the position and they'll be moving on in time. Democrats have no true interest in stopping the anti-black attacks being carried out by the Republicans because it was Democrats who began attacking woke stronger and earlier than the Republicans, and they did it to protect the thugs in blue. As Democrats see it, allowing the Republicans to attack black people helps to eliminate the threat that our continued movement represents. The few times Democrats have appeared to do something for black people was back in the 1960s. And they only did it because of the massive pressure put on them by the grassroots. The matchup of Trump versus Biden is noteworthy, but where black empowerment is concerned, it is no more important than Biden versus Bernie, or Bernie versus Hillary, or Biden versus Trump for that matter. I think we all see how that one turned out. Or Kamala Harris versus Tulsi Gabbard. By the way, on a side note, I remarked on how Gabbard humiliated Kamala in Detroit for her reprehensible record as a prosecutor, but you notice I never endorsed or said anything charitable about Tulsi Gabbard afterwards. I didn't even mention her name. And given her behavior the last couple of years, I think you can now see why. These squabbles between Democrats and Republicans, or even Republicans against other Republicans and vice versa, aren't about us. These are internal arguments between a couple of gangs of anti-black racists about which one of them is going to hold the whip over us. Yes, the racists are on the march, but so are we. And believe me when I tell you, it's far more important what we do than what they do. The goal of elections for us is not to get some racist stooge in the White House. Our goal is black empowerment. The tangible resources and wealth that we created and continue to perpetuate that must be put in the hands of the people who made it. Both parties want to render us irrelevant to the process so the status quo can be maintained. But unfortunately for them, we're not just limiting our activity to the ballot box. When it comes to which direction this country is going to take, whether they like it or not, we get a vote in that too. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Keith B., Maurice Soul, Frederica Moore, Wendell, and Rashad Marsh. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.